In the year 1832, in a small Appalachian town, something happened that people would whisper about for generations. It was not a war, nor a fire, nor a crime committed in daylight, but a quiet choice made behind timber walls as dusk settled cold and blue over the valley. On that particular evening, the wind carried a restless sound through the pines, and a single knock upon a wooden door divided mercy from fear. Long after the snow melted and the fields turned green again, neighbors would lower their voices when speaking of the Carter family, and the night they chose to lock the door. The town of Briar Glen rested between dark rolling hills and a narrow river that moved like polished steel beneath the winter sky, its waters whispering against frost-bound stones. It was late November, the last leaves clung brittle to oak branches, and the scent of chimney smoke hung low across the valley as families prepared for an early and unforgiving winter. Cabins stood sturdy but weathered, built from hand-hewn logs chinked with clay, their roofs dusted with snow that glittered faintly beneath a thin silver moon. At the edge of town, where forest pressed close and shadows lingered longest, stood the Carter homestead, modest yet well kept, its barn leaning slightly from years of mountain wind. Thomas Carter was a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and steady hands hardened by timber work, his eyes pale and thoughtful, often scanning tree lines as though measuring unseen threats. He earned his living hauling cut logs downriver, a trade that demanded strength and patience, and he carried both qualities in silence rather than speech. His wife, Margaret Carter, possessed softer features and dark hair pinned carefully beneath a woolen bonnet, her voice gentle but firm when tending children or mending torn coats by firelight. Their eldest son, Samuel, nearing 16, had begun to mirror his father's guarded manner, though curiosity flickered in his gaze whenever travelers passed through town with stories of distant cities. Little Clara, only 9, moved through the cabin with quiet grace, humming hymns beneath her breath, pressing her palms to frost-covered windows to watch the world beyond. Though the Carters were respected for their diligence and faith, Thomas carried within him a cautious streak born of hard winters and whispered tales of thieves wandering the mountain roads. That caution, once useful and protective, had begun to harden into something heavier, a quiet mistrust that settled over him like the coming snow. And as the nights grew longer and the wind sharpened its voice through the trees, that mistrust waited for a moment to prove itself either wisdom or regret. The afternoon before the knock came, the sky had turned a dull iron gray, and crows gathered along the fence posts as though anticipating a storm not yet seen. Thomas had returned early from the river, his boots caked with frozen mud, his jaw set tighter than usual after hearing unsettling news in town. 2 farms west of Briar Glen had been visited by strangers, men asking for shelter, men who vanished before dawn with silverware and horses. They speak soft, then disappear with what ain't theirs, the blacksmith had warned, his hammer striking iron with sharp conviction. Thomas carried that warning home like a hidden ember, warming his fear and sharpening his caution as the sun slipped behind the ridge. Margaret listened quietly while stirring a pot of beans over the hearth, her brow furrowing at the thought of desperate travelers wandering in winter. "Cold makes men bold, or broken," she said gently, glancing toward the darkening window where wind pressed thin fingers of frost. Samuel leaned near the door, whittling at a scrap of wood, curiosity outweighing caution in his young heart as he imagined faceless men on lonely roads. Clara, sensing unease without understanding it, drew closer to the fire, clutching her rag doll as logs cracked and settled into glowing embers. By twilight, the valley had grown silent, snow beginning to fall in slow drifting spirals, each flake vanishing against the frozen ground. Thomas secured the shutters with deliberate care, testing each latch twice, his movements precise and resolute. Margaret noticed the extra bar placed across the door and felt a weight settle in her chest that had little to do with winter. "Not every stranger bears ill will," she murmured, though her voice lacked full certainty. Thomas answered without looking at her, "And not every stranger bears mercy." The words lingered between them, heavier than the timber beams overhead, as the wind gathered strength beyond the cabin walls. Hours passed, and the family settled into uneasy quiet, the fire shrinking low as snow thickened outside. Then it came, a single knock upon the wooden door, firm yet weary, neither hurried nor demanding. Clara's breath caught softly. Samuel stood upright, and Margaret's spoon froze midair above the kettle. The knock came again, accompanied by a faint voice carried thinly through the storm. "Please," the voice called, strained and distant. "For the love of God, I seek only warmth for the night." Thomas stepped toward the door, his shadow tall against the flickering firelight, his hand hovering near the heavy bar he had so carefully set. For a long moment Thomas stood without speaking, the wind pressing hard against the logs, the stranger's breath visible through the narrow seam of the shutter. Margaret moved closer, her hand resting lightly upon her husband's sleeve, feeling the tremor beneath his steady exterior. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice no louder than the crackle of embers, "we have known hunger, and we have known cold." The knock did not come again, only the soft scrape of boots shifting upon frozen earth and the faint rattle of wind-tossed branches. Samuel stepped forward, eyes bright with unease and curiosity, wanting to see the face beyond the timber barrier. Thomas drew a slow breath, then another, as though weighing something heavier than wood or iron. He lifted the latch slightly, just enough to hear the wind more clearly, but not enough to see. Through the narrow opening came a thin voice again, weaker now. "Sir, I have walked since dawn. The storm caught me beyond the ridge." Margaret's gaze moved to the hearth, to the spare loaf wrapped in cloth, to the wool blanket folded near Clara's bed. "We have little," Thomas muttered, as though convincing himself rather than anyone else. The stranger coughed beyond the door, a hollow sound swallowed quickly by the wind. Clara's small voice trembled from beside the fire. "Papa, he sounds like he's hurting." Thomas's jaw tightened, his mind filled with stories of farms robbed under the guise of mercy. "If he enters," Thomas said low, "we cannot undo it." Margaret's hand slipped from his sleeve, her eyes searching his face for a sign of the man she had married. Another silence settled, thick and heavy as the snowfall outside. At last Thomas lowered the latch fully, sliding the wooden bar into place with a final, echoing thud. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, sharp against the quiet cabin walls. No cry followed, no pounding, only the fading crunch of footsteps retreating into the storm. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, pressing her palm to her mouth as though to hold something back. Samuel remained near the door long after the sound disappeared, listening for what might return. Through the night the wind howled fiercely, circling the cabin like a restless spirit unwilling to depart. Thomas did not sleep, though he lay rigid beneath his blanket, staring at the ceiling beams as snow drifted thick against the windows. Near dawn the storm quieted, leaving the valley still and pale beneath a washed gray sky. When Thomas stepped outside, breath fogging in the bitter air, he saw the tracks leading from his door, then faltering near the tree-line. The prints staggered, uneven and uncertain, before vanishing beneath a drift where snow had piled deep. He stood there longer than necessary, the silence pressing harder than the wind ever had. By mid-morning word traveled through Briar Glen that a man had been found near the ridge, frozen where he had fallen beneath the pines. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, piecing together fragments of the traveler's path, tracing it back toward the Carter homestead. And though no accusation was spoken aloud, a quiet understanding settled across the valley like a second snowfall. By noon the church bell tolled slow and hollow, its sound rolling across the frozen fields like a question without answer. Thomas stood among the gathered townsfolk near the ridge, snow creaking beneath boots as men removed their hats in solemn silence. The traveler lay upon a sled fashioned from barn boards, his coat thin, his beard rimmed with frost that sparkled faintly beneath the pale sun. Samuel recognized the worn leather satchel resting against the stranger's side, the same one he had glimpsed through the narrow crack of the door. A farmer knelt and opened the satchel gently, revealing not stolen goods nor weapons, but folded letters bound with twine. Inside were pages addressed to a wife in Ohio, and a small pair of knitted mittens wrapped carefully in cloth. Margaret covered her mouth, the image of spare blankets by her hearth burning sharper than the winter air. The preacher cleared his throat, his breath rising in a trembling cloud, and spoke quietly of mercy tested in hard seasons. No one looked directly at Thomas, yet space opened subtly around him, a circle formed not by distance alone, but by unspoken understanding. Samuel's eyes searched his father's face, seeking certainty, finding only a rigid stillness that bordered on stone. "I thought to protect what is ours," Thomas said at last, his voice low and strained against the wind. The words fell into the snow without comfort, swallowed quickly like the traveler's fading tracks. That evening, as dusk returned to Briar Glen, Thomas stood again before his own door, staring at the timber he had barred so firmly. He lifted the latch slowly, letting the cold air rush inside unchecked, as though daring the night to test him again. But the valley remained silent, and the only echo that answered him was the memory of a single knock carried forever in his mind. Winter lingered long in Briar Glen that year, snow resting stubborn upon rooftops, smoke rising thin and uncertain against a pale, watchful sky. The Carter home remained sturdy as ever, yet something within its walls had shifted, a quiet draft no fire could entirely warm. Margaret kept a lantern lit beside the door each evening, its glow spilling gently across the threshold as if welcoming footsteps that never came. Samuel grew older with a seriousness beyond his years, listening always for distant sounds along the road, measuring his father's silence against the wind. Thomas worked harder than before, chopping wood until his hands split and hauling timber without complaint, as though labor might drown the memory of one fading voice. Sometimes, in the still hour before dawn, he would stand by the door and rest his palm against the grain, feeling the place where mercy had paused and fear had prevailed. No one in town spoke openly of blame, yet kindness toward strangers became a quiet custom thereafter. Bread shared more freely, doors opened a little quicker at dusk. And in that valley, people learned that some mistakes don't echo loudly, they whisper for generations.